Loneliness was not a feeling in these mountains, it was a presence. It had a weight that settled on the great, stooped shoulders of the pines and a voice that whispered in the scouring wind that peeled granite from the peaks. For a man named Elias, it was also a cloak, woven from silence and sorrow, which he had worn for 5 winters since the world below had taken everything from him. He had retreated into the mountain's heart, building a cabin of thick, unyielding logs, as if to wall out memory itself. The townsfolk called him the Mountain Man, or in their crueler moments, Too Fat Elias, a jab at the broad, powerful frame that now carried only the heft of his grief. His size, which had once been a source of simple, physical pride, was now just a larger vessel for emptiness. He spoke to no one but the ravens, and his days were a quiet ritual of survival, chopping wood, checking snares, and staring into the fire as it consumed the hours, each flame a ghost of the life he had lost. His heart was a frozen lake, and he had no desire for the thaw. One afternoon, when the autumn air was sharp with the promise of another siege, a sound intruded upon his sanctuary. It was the creak of a cart, the reluctant plod of a tired horse. Elias stood on his porch, a monolith of patched leather and beard, his hand resting on the axe handle embedded in a chopping block. The cart, driven by the town magistrate, Barrow, a man with a face like pinched dough, carried a grim cargo. 3 children, huddled together on a bed of straw, their faces pale and smudged with dirt. The oldest, a girl of perhaps 10, held a tiny, silent child in her lap, while a boy of about 8 glared at the world with the furious, impotent rage of the powerless. Barrow pulled the horse to a halt, refusing to meet Elias's gaze. Their parents were taken by the lung fever, the magistrate said, his voice thin in the vast quiet. No one in town will have them. They say the sickness clings to them. Elias said nothing. His silence was a wall far more formidable than his cabin. The town council voted, Barrow continued, finally looking up. They are your responsibility. You live on town land, you take the town's burdens. The girl, Ilara, clutched the smaller child tighter. The boy, Finn, spat on the ground. The youngest, a wisp of a thing named Calla, just stared with eyes that seemed to hold all the sorrow of the world. Elias's first instinct was a guttural no, a rejection as absolute as the mountain itself. He had come here to be alone with his ghosts, not to collect new ones. But then his eyes fell on the smallest, Calla, and for a fleeting, agonizing second, she looked like his own daughter, lost to a fever just like theirs. The frozen lake of his heart did not thaw, but a single, hairline crack appeared in the ice. He gave a slow, ponderous nod, a motion that felt like a mountain shifting. Barrow unloaded their meager bundle, then turned the cart around without another word, leaving the 3 orphans standing in the shadow of the giant who did not want them. The first winter was a siege, not against the cold, but against the silence that filled the spaces between them. The cabin, once a solitary man's refuge, was now crowded with 4 distinct solitudes. Elias moved with a deliberate, quiet economy, his large frame surprisingly graceful as he tended the fire, cooked the tough, stringy meat from his traps, and mended their worn-out boots with thick, waxed thread. He did not speak to them, and they did not speak to him. Communication was a language of objects. A bowl of hot stew left on the table was a question of their hunger. An extra blanket laid at the foot of their shared cot was a concession to the biting cold. A sharpened stick left by the door was an offering of a tool. The children, in turn, answered in their own silent dialect. Ilara, the pragmatic one, would wash the bowls and stack them neatly, a gesture of order in a world of chaos. She watched his every move, her eyes cataloguing his skills, judging his capacity to keep them alive. Finn, the defiant one, was a knot of anger. He would perform the tasks Elias set for him, hauling wood, fetching water, with a sullen fury, sometimes slamming a log onto the pile with a crack that echoed his own splintered spirit. Calla, the smallest, was a phantom. She moved through the cabin like a breath of mist, her presence felt more than seen. She would sit for hours by the fire, her thumb in her mouth, her gaze lost in the flames. Around her neck, on a thin leather cord, she wore a small, crudely carved wooden bird. Elias noticed it one evening as the firelight caught the dark wood. It was a starling, its shape simple but unmistakable. A flicker of something, a distant ache of a memory not his own, stirred in the back of his mind before he ruthlessly suppressed it. It was just a child's trinket, a relic from a life that was ash. He had enough relics of his own. Their survival depended on the unsentimental present. Mistrust was the air they breathed. When he skinned a rabbit, Finn would watch with a mixture of revulsion and fascination, his hand never far from a heavy piece of kindling, as if he expected the big man to turn on them at any moment. Elias was aware of their fear. He saw how they flinched when he moved too quickly, how their breathing would stop when he returned from the forest, his huge form filling the doorway, silhouetted against the blinding snow. He did nothing to soothe them. He simply provided food, warmth, shelter. It was all he had to give. His heart was a locked room, and he had long ago thrown away the key. When the world finally began to thaw, so too did something imperceptible within the cabin walls. Spring arrived not as a gentle guest but as a roaring force, the cracking of river ice like cannon fire, the meltwater turning the mountain paths into torrents. The oppressive silence of the snow-covered world was replaced by the cacophony of life returning. For Elias, it meant work. He took Finn out to check the snares, the ground now soft and forgiving. He didn't speak, he showed. He demonstrated how to read the tracks in the mud, how to find the game trails, how to set the wire loop so it was both effective and humane. He would point, grunt, and gesture with his large, calloused hands. Finn, at first resentful of the instruction, slowly became absorbed. The anger in his eyes was gradually replaced by a sharp, focused intelligence. He learned quickly, and one day, he brought back a grouse on his own. He laid it at Elias's feet, a silent offering of pride and proof. Elias met his gaze and gave a single, slow nod of approval. It was more than 1,000 words of praise. For Elara, the lessons were in the green shoots that pushed through the soil. Elias showed her which roots to dig for, which leaves were medicine and which were poison. He taught her how to tap the birch trees for their sweet, clear water. Her natural caution made her a meticulous student. She would bring him plants for inspection, her brow furrowed in concentration, waiting for his nod before adding them to her basket. She was rebuilding their security, one edible root at a time. Her fear of him had softened into a kind of wary respect. He was no longer a monster, but a mountain, vast, unknowable, but solid. Calla remained his shadow. She would follow him as he worked, her small feet making no sound. While he split logs, she would gather the chips of wood. While he repaired the roof, she would sit on the porch below, weaving blades of grass into intricate patterns. She never asked for anything, but her presence was a constant, quiet question. One afternoon, as he sat carving a new handle for his axe, she approached and sat beside him. He continued his work, the knife peeling away long, fragrant curls of pine. After a long while, she reached out a tiny hand and laid it on his forearm, just for a moment. Her touch was as light as a moth's wing. It sent a jolt through him, a warmth that was entirely unfamiliar. He stopped carving. He looked down at her, and she looked back, her wide, solemn eyes holding no fear at all. In that moment, the hairline crack in the frozen lake of his heart widened, and for the first time in 5 years, he felt the painful, terrifying sensation of a single drop of water seeping through. Summer came in a wave of green and gold, and with it, a new rhythm. The cabin was no longer just a shelter from the storm, it was becoming a home. The days were long and filled with a purpose that went beyond mere survival. They were building. Elias, with Finn now a surprisingly strong and capable assistant, added a linter for storing firewood. The sound of his hammer echoed through the valley, a steady, declarative beat. He taught the boy how to notch logs, how to read the grain of the wood, how to build something that would stand against the wind. Finn's hands, once clenched into useless fists of rage, were now learning to create. He was finding an outlet for his intensity, shaping the world around him instead of just railing against it. Elara took charge of the garden, a small plot of land Elias had cleared behind the cabin. With the herbs and seeds she had carefully gathered, she cultivated neat rows of hardy vegetables and medicinal plants. She was a natural nurturer, and the patch of dark earth became her kingdom. She would spend hours there, humming softly to herself, a sound so alien and yet so welcome in the profound quiet. She was tending not just to plants, but to the fragile roots of their new life. The cabin began to change. Elara insisted on a cleanliness that went beyond simple utility. She scrubbed the floors with pine needles and water, and the air filled with a clean, sharp scent. She found a patch of wild lavender and dried the blossoms, placing them in small cloth bundles around the room. Calla, in her silent way, contributed beauty. She would leave small bouquets of wildflowers on the table, fireweed, columbine, Indian paintbrush. She decorated the window sills with interesting stones and fallen feathers. Elias watched all of this with a kind of stunned detachment. He had built the cabin to be a tomb for his memories, a fortress of solitude. These children were turning it into something alive. They were filling its empty spaces with their presence, with the scent of lavender, with the quiet industry of their hands. One evening, as the four of them sat at the table, a comfortable silence settled between them. The fire crackled, the lamp cast a warm, golden glow, and the sounds of the crickets outside were a gentle chorus. Elias looked at the three faces illuminated by the light. Finn, no longer glaring, was intently mending a tear in his trousers. Elara was carefully sorting seeds for the next spring. Calla was drawing patterns in a bit of spilled flour on the table. He felt a strange, protective swell in his chest, a feeling he had thought long dead and buried. These were not his burdens. They were his flock. The second winter arrived with a sudden, vicious snarl, as if the mountain were jealous of the peace that had settled in the small cabin. A blizzard descended from the peaks, a churning wall of white that erased the world and imprisoned them in a cocoon of howling wind and drifting snow. It was a test of the home they had built, a trial for the family they had become. The logs held. The stores were ample. But the cold was a living thing, seeping through the smallest cracks, and it found its way to the smallest among them. Calla fell ill. It began as a cough, a small, dry sound in the night, but it quickly deepened into a fever that left her listless and burning. Elara sat by her side constantly, bathing her forehead with snowmelt and trying to spoon thin broth between her pale lips. Finn paced the cabin like a caged wolf, his helplessness turning back into a familiar, restless anger. Elias watched, a cold dread gripping him, a terrible echo of the past. He recognized the rasp in Calla's breathing, the glassy look in her eyes. It was the same lung fever that had taken his wife, his daughter, and the children's parents. But this time, he was not helpless. Anya, his wife, had been a healer. She had taught him much about the mountain's remedies. He knew of one, a rare root called lungwort that grew only on the high, wind-blasted ledges, a plant that thrived in the harshest conditions. To reach it now would be madness. The storm was a churning fury. But looking at Calla's small, still form, he knew there was no choice. He pulled on his heaviest furs, took his axe, and wrapped a coil of rope over his shoulder. Elara looked at him, her eyes wide with fear. "Don't," she whispered, the first word she had ever spoken to him directly. He placed a heavy hand on her shoulder. "I will return," he rumbled, his voice rough from disuse. The journey was a battle against a god of ice and wind. He could barely see, the snow a blinding veil. The cold bit deep, and the wind threatened to tear him from the rock face. He climbed, driven by a ghost, haunted by a promise he was making to the past. He found the lungwort, its dark leaves stark against the snow, and turned back. When he finally stumbled through the cabin door hours later, caked in ice and half frozen, he was met with a sight that stopped him cold. Finn was sitting on the floor by Calla's bed, holding her hand. He looked up at Elias, his young face etched with a terror so profound it was heartbreaking. As Elias collapsed by the fire, exhausted, Finn rushed to his side, helping him out of the frozen furs. The boy's hands were trembling. Elias, thinking ahead to the spring, had considered taking the children back down to the valley once Calla was well. They were strong now, capable. They could be fostered, find a proper life. He had done his duty. But as he sat there, catching his breath, Finn looked at him, his defiant mask completely gone, replaced by a raw, desperate vulnerability. "Stay," the boy begged, the word a ragged plea. "Don't leave. Stay." It was not a request. It was an anchor, thrown from a boy who had lost everything, trying to moor himself to the only solid thing left in his world. In that moment, Elias knew he was not just their keeper. He was their home. And he was not going anywhere. Years passed like the turning of the seasons, each one deepening the roots of their unlikely family. Finn grew tall and strong, his anger honed into a quiet, watchful strength. He knew the mountain as well as Elias now, his hands as capable with an axe or a snare. Elara blossomed, her pragmatic nature softening into a gentle authority. The cabin and its surroundings were her domain, a place of order, healing, and abundance. Calla, though still quiet, was no longer a phantom. Her silence was a deep well of observation and wisdom. She communicated with a glance, a touch, a shared smile that could light up the entire cabin. The word orphan had long since faded from their lives, replaced by the unspoken truths of brother, sister, and something akin to father. The carved starling still hung around Calla's neck, its wood now smooth and dark from the touch of her hands. One evening, as she sat with Elias by the fire, she held it up to the light. She was nearly a young woman now, her eyes holding the same old soul gravity they had when she was a child. "He has a name," she said, her voice soft but clear. Elias looked at the bird. "It's just a carving, little one, no," she insisted gently. "A name." Anya gave him 1 inch. The name struck Elias like a physical blow. Anya. The sound of it, unheard for so long, was a key turning in a rusted lock deep inside him. His hand stilled. The world seemed to stop spinning. "Anya," he whispered, the name a strange and painful shape on his tongue. "Who is Anya?" Calla looked at him, her expression serious. "The mountain woman. The healer. My mother was sick, a long time ago. Before the fever. Anya would come down from the mountain to give her herbs. She carved this for me. She said starlings are tough. She said they know how to survive the winter." The story tumbled out of her, a memory preserved in the amber of childhood. A kind woman with warm hands and eyes the color of the summer sky. A woman who smelled of pine and chamomile. A woman who hummed as she worked. Elias felt the air leave his lungs. He saw it all with a sudden, devastating clarity. His Anya, his healer wife, making secret trips to the village to help those in need, never telling him because she knew he worried. He remembered her carving by the fire, her hands deft and sure, coaxing life from a block of wood. He remembered her fascination with starlings. He had thought his grief and their tragedy were two separate, parallel lines of sorrow. He was wrong. They were woven together, threads in the same tapestry of loss. Anya had known their mother. She had held this child. She had tried to save them. He was not a stranger who had taken in 3 orphans. He was the unwitting inheritor of his wife's final act of kindness. He reached out and gently touched the starling, his large finger tracing the shape his wife's hands had made. A decade of ice in his heart didn't just crack, it shattered. The grief was still there, a vast and deep lake, but it was no longer frozen. Tears, hot and unfamiliar, streamed down his face and into his beard. Calla watched him, and then she leaned her head against his massive shoulder, a silent, perfect understanding passing between them. The past, however, is never truly buried. It is merely sleeping. One day in late summer, a man on a fine horse rode up the mountain path. He was dressed in the clothes of a wealthy merchant from the city, his face sharp and predatory. He introduced himself as Silas Blackwood, and the name alone was enough to make the blood in Elias's veins run cold. Blackwood was the man who had owned the land Elias and Anya had once farmed, the man whose greed had forced them into a debt they could never repay, driving them from their home and indirectly leading to the accident that had claimed Anya and their daughter. He was the architect of Elias's exile. "This is a surprise," Blackwood said, his eye scanning the well-kept cabin, the thriving garden, the sturdy woodpile, with a calculating gaze. "I purchased this entire tract of mountain land from the town council. A delinquent tax sale. Imagine my shock when my survey maps showed a squatter's residence. He produced a rolled-up deed, the official seal glinting in the sun. Finn, now a young man of 18, stepped forward, his hand resting on the axe propped against the cabin wall. Elara came to stand on the porch, her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. Calla emerged from the trees, a silent wraith joining their ranks. Blackwood's eyes flickered over the three of them with disdain. "And you collected vagrants, I see." No matter, he turned his cold gaze back to Elias. "I am a reasonable man. I will give you 1 week to gather your things and your attachments, and vacate my property." The word property hung in the air, an insult to the life they had built. This land was not a set of lines on a map, it was their home, consecrated by sweat, by sorrow, and by love. Elias looked at Blackwood, and for the first time in years, the old, dormant rage began to stir within him. This man, this ghost from a life of pain, had come to shatter the peace he had so painstakingly found. But before he could speak, Finn took another step forward. "This is our home," Finn said, his voice low and steady, not the hot anger of a boy, but the cold resolve of a man. Blackwood chuckled, a dry, dismissive sound. "A boy with an axe does not frighten me. The law is the law." He looked past them, toward the tall pines and the clear, running stream. "I plan to bring logging crews up here by winter. This is all coming down." The week that followed was thick with a tension that was worse than any winter storm. Silas Blackwood had set up a lavish tent a short distance down the mountain, a visible, arrogant symbol of his claim. He made no further move, content to let the deadline approach, certain of his victory. Inside the cabin, a profound quiet reigned, but it was not the quiet of peace. It was the heavy silence of a decision being weighed. Elias did not sleep. He sat by the dying embers of the fire each night, the deed Blackwood had shown him seared into his mind. He was a squatter. Legally, he had no right to be here. The world he had fled, with its rules and its paper and its cold transactions, had finally found him. His first instinct was to protect the children. He would take them away, find another mountain, another forgotten corner of the world where they could be safe. He had built a life for them once, he could do it again. He could not bear the thought of Blackwood's callous world touching them. He owed it to Anya's memory to see them safe. He would tell them in the morning. They would pack what they could and leave under the cover of darkness. He would not allow a confrontation. He would not risk them for a patch of dirt and a pile of logs. He had lost one family to the cruelties of men like Blackwood, he would not lose another. But when morning came, and he gathered them at the table to speak, he found he could not form the words. He looked at their faces. He saw not fear, but a calm, unshakable determination. It was Elara who spoke first, her voice as solid and dependable as the mountain itself. "We are not leaving," she said. It was not a question. It was a statement of fact. Finn nodded, his jaw set. "He'll have to drag us out." Elias looked at them, his heart aching. "You don't understand," he began, his voice a low rumble of anguish. "He has the law. He can bring men, sheriffs." It was then that Calla, who had been silent through it all, stepped forward. She walked to Elias and stood before him, looking up into his troubled face. She reached up and took one of his massive, calloused hands in both of hers. She did not speak, but her eyes held a fierce, unwavering loyalty that struck him dumb. In that moment, he understood. This was not his decision to make alone. For a decade, he had been their protector, their provider, their shield. But they were no longer frightened children. They were a family, and a family stands its ground together. Their home was not just the cabin, it was the circle of loyalty they had forged in the heart of the wilderness. To run would be to break that circle. To run would be to admit that a piece of paper was more powerful than the life they had built with their own hands. A great, shuddering breath escaped him. The weight of his past failure seemed to lift, replaced by the formidable strength of their love. He looked from Finn's resolve to Elara's steadfastness to Calla's silent devotion. He was not alone. He nodded slowly. "We stay." On the 7th day, Silas Blackwood rode up to the cabin, 2 armed men flanking him. He expected to find a deserted homestead, a defeated man and his scattered wards. Instead, he found a fortress. Elias stood on the porch, not with a weapon in his hand, but with a stillness that was more intimidating than any show of force. To his right stood Finn, holding not an axe for a fight, but a shovel from his work in the garden. To his left stood Ilara, holding a basket of herbs, her gaze clear and direct. And standing just in front of Elias, a small, defiant shield before a great mountain, was Calla. She held nothing but the small, carved starling in her hand, clutching it like a talisman. Blackwood pulled his horse to a halt, his face twisting in annoyance. "I see you've chosen the foolish path," he sneered. "I have a legal order. You will be removed." Elias took a step forward. His voice, when it came, was not a shout, but a low, resonant rumble that seemed to come from the very bedrock of the mountain. "This land is not empty, Blackwood. This land has a family on it. You can have your paper." "It means nothing here," Blackwood laughed. "And what are you going to do, old man? Fight the law?" "We are not going to fight you," Ilara said, her voice cutting through the tension. But we are not going to leave. The simple, unadorned truth of her statement seemed to confuse Blackwood. He was a man who understood threats, violence, and transactions. He did not understand this quiet, unified resistance. He looked from one face to another, seeing not fear, but an unbreakable, interlocking resolve. These were not vagrants. This was a clan. He gestured to his men, but even they hesitated, faced with a strength they could not quantify. There was no easy victory here, only a messy, protracted struggle against people who had nothing left to lose and everything to protect. Blackwood, a creature of profit and loss, did a quick, cold calculation. The cost in time, effort, and reputation to forcibly remove this strange, defiant family was not worth the timber he would gain. His power was based on the assumption that others would yield. These people would not. Defeated by an enemy he could not comprehend, he spat on the ground. "Keep your cursed mountain," he snarled, yanking on his horse's reins. "It's not worth the trouble." He and his men turned and rode away, their departure a stark contrast to their arrogant arrival. They did not look back. The dust from Blackwood's retreat settled back onto the mountain path, and a profound silence descended, deeper and more peaceful than any that had come before. The confrontation was over. The past had been met and turned away, not by violence, but by the simple, unassailable power of belonging. Elias watched them go, his great shoulders finally unburdening themselves of a weight he had carried for more than a decade. He felt the gaze of the three young people who stood with him, their family, forged not of blood but of shared winters and silent understanding. He turned and looked at them. He saw Finn, the angry boy, now a steadfast man. He saw Ilara, the frightened girl, now a confident caregiver. He saw Calla, the lost child, now the quiet heart of their world. He was no longer a grieving recluse hiding from the world. He was a patriarch, the center of a universe he had never intended to create. Calla stepped toward him and held out her hand. In her palm lay the wooden starling. He looked down at it, the small bird his Anya had carved, the totem that had unknowingly connected all of their stories. It was no longer a symbol of what he had lost. It was a testament to what he had found. It represented a kindness that had echoed through time, a love that had planted a seed in one family and seen it bloom in another. He gently closed Calla's fingers over the bird. "It's yours," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "It brought you home." They went back inside the cabin as the sun began to set, casting long, peaceful shadows across the valley. The fire was lit, and the warm glow filled the room, pushing back the encroaching darkness. There was no need for words. The victory was in the shared meal, in the familiar quiet, in the simple, sacred act of being together in the place they had defended and claimed as their own. Elias looked into the flames and saw not the ghosts of his past, but the faces of his future. He had come to the mountain seeking an ending, a place to let his story fade into silence. Instead, in the most unlikely of ways, he had found a new beginning. For a home, he finally understood, was not a shelter built of wood and stone. It was a fortress built of loyalty, a sanctuary walled with love, a place where the broken pieces of a life could be gathered up and made whole again. And in the heart of the great, silent mountain, the four of them were finally, completely, home.